What's up guys, my name is Josh and welcome to another headphone review. Today we're actually going to be talking about a very interesting headphone, the Focal Elex. Now before I get into this review, I do want to make you aware of two things. One, I will have two videos of direct comparisons between the Elex and the DT1990 and the Elex and the Focal Utopia. I think those would both be very interesting comparisons for this specific headphone. All right, now let's finally get into the actual review portion of this video. Okay, so my overall impressions of the sound is just to say, wow. These are a very impressive headphone in terms of technicality and actual listenability. They're very enjoyable for certain things, and I'll get more into that in a second and why I say that. This headphone is impressive in a lot of categories. It's very tight, it's very well refined, and it's very all-encompassing in almost every aspect of how one would judge a headphone. I would say this falls ever so slightly above, a little bit brighter than what I would consider to be perfectly neutral, but that's my own definition. I think everybody's definition of neutrality is a little bit different, so take that portion with a grain of salt. And even though it's a little bit brighter than what I would consider to be perfectly neutral, and I mean just a little bit brighter, it's not at all what I would consider to be a sterile sound. It's very inviting. This headphone is also an incredibly loud sounding headphone. So when I get into the mid-range area, I'll talk about dynamics a little bit more and what I mean by a very loud headphone. For now, let's go ahead and jump into treble. The treble performance is highly commendable. It's enjoyable and it's present without feeling too clinical or overly assertive. It's something that I personally really enjoy. Now, the airiness factor to it, comparing directly against the 1990s, I think falls somewhere in between the 1990s and the LCD2Cs in terms of the airiness of the room. Now for the mid-range, vocals are, in one word, awesome. They're very good. The tonality is excellent. The presentation, the detail is just there for the taking, and it's incredibly easy to listen to vocals on this headphone. I have no caveats for the vocal tonality or performance. They do have good separation from the background, although not particularly amazing, but it's still very, very separatable. It's very, you can isolate it quite easily. In general, especially when you get into the lower frequencies of the mid-range, it creates a very rich, very inviting sound signature in terms of the vocals. It's a very good listening environment, I would say. So the dynamics are my only caveat to this headphone. And I've been wrapping my head around a way to explain this in a manner that is both complimentary and creates a sense of what exactly to expect with this headphone. And real quick, if you don't know what dynamics are basically the difference between the highest and loudest point of the music that you're listening to and the lowest point. And this can go for the overall song. This can go for a very finite time period in the song, maybe even one note, even more finite than that. And headphones that have compressed dynamics generally tend to bring up the low points and bring down the high points. And a lot of modern music is actually compressed. And that's when people say that the music sounds compressed. That's basically what they're talking about. They're talking about the dynamics. Now, when a headphone or speaker system has very either accurate or large dynamics, it's basically saying that that compressed dynamic isn't a thing. And they have very quiet points of the song and very loud points of the song. This headphone, in terms of technicality for dynamics, is simply incredible. It really, really is. But it does make certain songs that I have, actually quite a few songs, not very enjoyable. Because with great dynamics, you get a very loud portion of the song, usually vocals, especially if it's a vocal-based track, but it doesn't necessarily apply only to vocals, where they have been mixed, where the vocals come very much forward and all the background instruments go towards the back. Now, this isn't necessarily accurate to what one would hear in real life. And my example of this is like if you have a singer in the front of the stage and drums in the background. I don't know if you've actually been around live drums, but they're incredibly loud, much louder if played hard than any singer could ever possibly compete with at a consistent level. The drummer is going to come across a lot louder than the singer is, and that's just kind of a reality of live music for that instrument in this particular case. So when recording and mastering a song, what one would do is bring down the volume of the drums and bring up the volume of the singer. Now on this headphone, the dynamics are so good, and I'm calling them good but not enjoyable here. It makes certain parts of songs come across so loud that I have to lower the volume down to where the rest of the music in the background is almost, it's just too low for enjoyment. And so you're listening to these bright peaks of sound, and then the rest of the song is just very low in volume. And so for certain tracks, especially things that weren't mastered to a T. And by mastered to a T, like I'm talking about like the Wailing Jennies or Daft Punk, things that are mastered very, very well sound incredible. And for certain songs, the Elex can play those songs better than any other headphone I've heard. But it does make some of my personal music. Now, if you're somebody who has only like perfectly mastered music, this isn't going to be a problem for you at all. In fact, it will probably be quite enjoyable. But if you have a mix of songs that were mastered just impeccably and songs that are kind of in the middle, and then songs that are mastered pretty poor like I do, where I have a mix of everything, this does make some of my music just simply not enjoyable. And that's one downside that I felt like I had to bring up to this headphone. And I spent so much time on it because, well, honestly, it's kind of like the only downside to this headphone. This headphone is an incredible performer. And that incredible performance extends into our next category, which is the bass response. Now, the bass response is good without at all being overly dramatized. It's tight, it's detailed, it's impactful. And while what I would consider to be very neutral, very respectable bass, if you're a bass head, this isn't really going to be the best headphone for you. Maybe look at LCD2Cs for a little bit warmer of a sound signature. The bass response is for people who are going for accuracy and not an emphasized approach, either more or less. And that goes for all the areas of sound, including mid-range and treble. Now, imaging and Soundstage is something else that this headphone is incredibly good at. It's a solid 9 out of 10. I wouldn't say it's absolutely perfect compared to some other things that I've heard, even in this price range, and even less actually, but it's definitely respectable. And the Soundstage, while not super wide, is very accurate within the field that it's given. I would say it's wider than the 650s, for example, but narrower than the K7XXs, if that gives you any frame of reference. It's kind of right in the middle there to where it feels natural. It does feel very, very accurate within the field that it's given though. And another impressive part of the Soundstage is that it's represented fairly circularly around your head, rather than some Soundstage and imaging that kind of goes on top of your head and kind of over. It almost sounds like it's going like kind of up in terms of things that are supposed to be coming from in front of you. This headphone has a very circular approach and a very even approach with, to me at least, no discernible weak points in terms of the Soundstage or imaging. So if anybody asks about gaming, they're absolutely more than capable of gaming. Definitely very, very good. Maybe not the best, but they can definitely stand the ground. They're pretty good. So let's talk about the build. This headphone is a little bit larger than it actually looks like. The headband structure, because it doesn't actually clamp closed, it means that the headphone is always kind of like in this open look, and they're actually quite large and not very compact at all. The headband is very thick. I'm not a huge fan of the headband, although it is comfortable and it's somewhat lightweight. The whole headphone, I think, comes in at like 450 grams. So it's kind of a medium weight headphone. To me, I do like the build of this headphone. I think it's got a great feel in the hand. It feels very sturdy, very solid. It's got a couple things that are very nice about it, like the hinge mechanisms for the ear cups. They're like spring loaded, so the ear cups kind of flex back as soon as you let go of them, which doesn't need that, but I'm glad it has it. The pads are simply incredible. Like, they are technically qualified as microfiber, although they feel like a very soft, very malleable Alcantara. And the inside feels like, the only thing I could describe it to is a downy feather pillow. Like, it's just so soft. It's softer than any headphone pad that I've ever tried. I don't know exactly what's in there, probably some very soft version of memory foam, but the pads are awesome. It's winter, obviously, for me here in Washington. It's fairly cold, so I don't know if heat would be an issue. That's a possibility, but so far I don't have any issues with temperature for long listening sessions with this headphone. And then I don't have the box here, but it does come with a storage box. It's fairly large, not really meant for travel, but it's a safe place to keep your headphones when you're not using them. And then something that I wish more companies would do, it provides you with two cables. One is going to terminate into a 1/4-inch single-ended input ending in 2-pole 3.5 millimeters for both the right and left ear cup. Then the other is going to be a balanced connector for your balanced amplifiers. So that addition was definitely appreciated. The braided cables, they're not the nicest in terms of like flexibility, but they're definitely great cables in terms of quality. Now, regarding what you need to power this headphone, it is fairly efficient. The impedance rating is at 80 ohms and the sound pressure level is at 104 decibels, which means that you can power this off of pretty much any amplifier. However, they are fairly revealing, which means that they're kind of amp picky, and certain amps sound better than others. For example, I have the THX 789 here, which is an incredible amplifier. And then it's kind of just case by case after that. They are affected by tubes, which is nice. I do have Mjolnir 2 here with some vintage tubes on it, and it sounds pretty good coming out of that too. So it's picky with the amplifiers. And I think this leads me into my conclusion here. This is a substantially impressive headphone, and it's so good in so many areas that it's nearly impossible for me not to recommend. That being said, I don't think that everybody is going to enjoy this headphone. I don't think it's going to be for everybody. I do think that the majority of people who get this headphone are going to be pleased and impressed with it, and I think it stands in a very unique position at this price for not only the technicality of it, but also the sound signature of it is unique in this price range, and there really isn't anything else that sounds like it that I've heard around the $500 to $1,000 mark. So I think it's a great addition. I think it's a great price. Like every headphone, there are caveats to it, but overall, it's definitely going to get a pass. This actually, for a disclaimer, this was sent by a viewer and a friend of the show. This wasn't sent to me by Massdrop like some of the other headphones that I've had here have been. And like always, all thoughts and opinions about this headphone are my own. To address something that didn't really fit in my standard review format, which is that Massdrop on their own website claimed this to be a form of like super HD 650. And I think this comparison is kind of interesting for a couple of reasons. One is that if you actually look at the frequency response for the mid-range of the Elex and the 6XX, they actually measure very, very similarly. There's not a whole lot of difference there. A couple of frequencies are a little bit different, as to be expected on a completely separate headphone, but they do measure fairly similarly. But on a personal note, I think what makes the HD 6XX so special is the roll-off on the treble and the bass, where you get this really centralized, very focused, very forward mid-range. And that is not happening on the Elex here. Now, I think the Elex is a better headphone for it. I think that the Elex has better capabilities in terms of treble, even better in the mid-range and better in the bass department by far. But it doesn't have the isolation factor for me that the 6XX has. Now, I do have a counter argument to this, and I'll try and keep this brief, but explain it as well as I can. So the clamping pressure on this is pretty substantial. Like, right here to here is very loose, but as soon as you get about here, which is about my size head, it becomes very, very tight. And the pads are so incredibly soft. So if you have a wide head, these pads are going to compress a lot. And on my head, the pads don't really compress that much because my head's somewhat slim. And the way I can kind of fake having a larger or wider head is just by listening to the music stock and then pressing on the pads. And this headphone is subject to some very severe changes when the pads get compressed. Everything becomes way more focused. The vocals get tighter, the imaging soundstage gets tighter, the bass gets brought up a little bit, the treble gets brought up a little bit, everything gets a little bit more intense. And when the pads are compressed like this, the sound actually does somewhat remind me of the HD 650s, which is kind of interesting. And the reason why I bring this up is to say that that might be where they're drawing that comparison from. And also, just in general on this headphone, depending on your head shape and size, more so than most other headphones, your mileage is going to vary a lot on what you actually end up hearing. All right, guys, thank you very much for watching. I will catch you in the next video. Yeah.